Hey guys, yesterday I filled out my best case scenario Senate map for the Democrats, and if you want to check that video out, I'll link it down in the description. In this one, I'm going to be filling out what I think is possibly the best case scenario for the Republicans going in to 2020. Now, the states that are currently in that brownish gray color, those are the ones that I want to do a little bit of a discussion on. Now, the states that are very dark red are very safe for the Republicans. The ones that are just a tinge of red below that, just to do a quick summary here, in a best case scenario, these are obviously states that the Republicans are going to continue to retain. So they have the incumbent in Montana with Steve Daines, and that would be a situation where you're probably not running against the Democratic Governor Bullock. If you're running against somebody maybe like a Wilmot Collins, then in that scenario, the Republicans would certainly be favored and picking that one up. In Kansas, going to be an open seat. Now, if it's Chris Kobach for the Republicans, that could make things a bit tricky. Maybe if it's Mike Pompeo, maybe he gives a bit of a better chance, but this is still a Republican-leaning state overall, statewide, and obviously in a best-case scenario for the Republicans, they would continue to keep that one. In Texas, it's starting to look a bit better, potentially for John Cornyn to continue to retain this seat. Obviously, he has the incumbency advantage, but he's not as well known in Texas as Senator Cruz was. That was a very competitive race that we saw in Texas back in 2018, but the Democratic field that's currently running for the party nomination, I don't think necessarily poses enough of a threat to Cornyn to where they could go and get enough votes statewide to go on and take down Cornyn. Now, if it was Beto O'Rourke, perhaps that's a different scenario, but I also think that O'Rourke might have hurt his chances slightly in a state like Texas, given his stance on guns during his run for that Democratic presidential nomination. So that might have, again, like I said, hurt his chances potentially to take on Cornyn if he decides to run in 2020. And then also you have Cindy Hyde-Smith, who won in a special election to take this seat, and then she's going to be running for it again here in 2020, but she proved that she could win the special election, so one would assume that she's going to have a pretty solid opportunity to go on and continue to retain that seat. The state of Georgia is going to have two senator elections, just the regular one with the incumbent David Perdue, who actually has pretty solid approval numbers right now, so that's a pretty good sign for him to go on and win that race. And then the special election is going to be replacing Isaacson, who's stepping down, and obviously Georgia still a slightly leaning Republican overall state. However, it has been trending in a more competitive direction given how the Atlanta as well as Atlanta suburban areas have been trending towards the Democrats, which is a huge population center in the state. That's making things a bit more interesting at the state-wide level, and we saw that in the 2018 governor's race. For instance, if it's Stacey Abrams that runs in the special election, that's probably the Democrats' best chance to pick up that particular seat, but in a best case, going to be giving both of those over to the Republicans. Now I want to do a bit of a more of a discussion here on these states that currently aren't filled in. Now, starting with Arizona, Martha McSally is technically the incumbent, but she was appointed to this seat, and I actually think her 2020 race might even be tougher against Mark Kelly, who's likely to be the Democratic Party nominee, in relation to her 2018 race where she went against the Democrat Kyrsten Sinema. But McSally, she has some name recognition, but even then, she probably doesn't even necessarily have as much name recognition as Mark Kelly. Going to be a tough one for the Republicans to try to retain there in Arizona, but in their best case, you would give that one certainly in what's likely to be a very competitive race, kind of like what we saw in 2018, over to the Republicans in this instance. Colorado, this is another one that's going to be really tough. Now, the Republicans do have the incumbency advantage with Cory Gardner. It looks like probably Hickenlooper is going to be the Democratic nominee, and if it's Hickenlooper versus Gardner, that's just a very tough scenario for Gardner to continue to retain that seat. But in a best-case scenario, I still think that Gardner is possibly able to keep this one in Colorado, but I think this one might be a little bit of a stress, especially if it's Gardner versus Hickenlooper. Over in Iowa, we don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be at this point in time in the field that we currently have. Not sure if there's somebody that can take down Joni Ernst. Now, Ernst's approval numbers have receded a bit over the past year, and she isn't all that well known in the state, given the fact that she hasn't been a senator all that long, just a freshman senator, and has only won one statewide election up to this point, but has proven that she can win a statewide election. Likely to be a very competitive Senate race, and it's probably going to depend on who the Democrats nominate if they have a serious shot at flipping this one. Likely to go right down to the wire, but in that best case for the Republicans, going to continue to retain that one with the incumbency advantage. Moving over to the state of Kentucky. Now, we just saw recently in a statewide election where the Democrats were able to defeat a very unpopular incumbent Republican in the governor's race. Now in 2020, we're getting a very unpopular incumbent Republican senator. So this could possibly be a very close race, especially if the Democrats maybe nominate somebody like a Matt Jones. I'm a little bit skeptical that Amy McGrath is going to be able to have enough success statewide to seriously contend against Mitch McConnell, but also giving that one over to the Republicans in this case. And then that right there would get them to the 51 seats that they would need to have the majority. But if they won the presidency, then they would only need 50 seats. Just to quickly go over these blue Senate races that aren't in dark blue. In Minnesota, you have Tina Smith. She just won the special election in the state by around double digits back in 2018. So she's looking pretty good to take that one. New Mexico has been a state that's been trending very favorably for the Democratic Party over the past decade. And even though it's an open race, still highly likely to go to the Democrats. And then also Virginia, they have the incumbency advantage with Mark Warner. And we just saw a Senate race in Virginia in the 2018 cycle where Tim Kaine absolutely dominated in that one. So one would expect Mark Warner to have success here. And I believe in the most recent approval numbers in the state of Virginia, Warner was actually even more approved of than Tim Kaine. So that's also another one that's very unlikely to go to the Republicans, even in a best case scenario for them. Now going down, talking about Alabama, this is an incumbent Democrat, actually. Doug Jones won the special election against Roy Moore. If Roy Moore ends up going against Doug Jones again, I think that's probably the Democrats' best case to continue to retain a Democratic Senate seat in what's one of the most Republican-leaning states in all of the United States. Doug Jones actually is above water right now with his approval, but let's just say it's Jeff Sessions or Tommy Tuberville or one of these other guys that's running for this Republican Party nomination. That probably makes things really tough for Doug Jones in his reelection bid. So probably, I would say it's definitely over a 50% chance at this point that the Republicans take this one, just given the overall partisan lean of the state, even though the Democrats will have the incumbency. Over in the state of North Carolina, this could be a tough one for the Republicans to retain because Thom Tillis, the incumbent, he's got two things working against him. He's underwater with his approval. He's one of the lowest overall approval of all 100 senators. And then on top of that, he's also one of the least known senators, which gives his incumbency advantage not as much. But the good news for the Republicans is right now, not necessarily the strongest Democratic contenders that are currently running for that party nomination, or at least Democrats that don't have a ton of name recognition or political clout necessarily in the state to take down an incumbent Republican. Going up to the state of Michigan, this one might be my furthest stretch here, where I think that you can't completely count out the Republicans in this one because even though the Democrats have the incumbency advantage with Gary Peters, kind of the same thing that we see with Thom Tillis in North Carolina, where Peters, he's not all that well known in the state, which gives his incumbency advantage not as much of a benefit to Peters. But the positive for Peters is he's above water with his approval, whereas Thom Tillis is not in North Carolina. He's probably going to be running against John James, and James was the Republican nominee in the 2018 midterms, and he was actually a little bit more competitive with Debbie Stabenow than I was expecting. He lost by about 7 percentage points, but that was more competitive than the governor's race, for instance, where the Democrat Whitmer was able to win by double digits. Now, John James, he's an African-American, and if he's able to just flip, it doesn't even have to be a majority, obviously, but a big population center in and around Detroit and the Detroit suburbs, the African-American vote is extremely important, and that's where the Democrats run up big margins in the state of Michigan, which gives them success more often than not in a lot of these statewide races. But if John James is able to crack into that enough, then that is a possible avenue for him to go on and pick this one up for the Republicans against the Democrat incumbent Gary Peters. And just a couple more races here. So New Hampshire, there's a lot of positives coming into this one for the Democrats. They have the incumbency advantage with Jeanne Shaheen. She's also one of the most approved of senators in her home state, which is a great sign for the Democrats. Out of all these northeastern states, New Hampshire is the one that can be, in general, a bit more competitive statewide. And also another good piece of news for the Democrats is the Republican governor, Sununu, isn't going to be running for this Senate seat. That would have given the Republicans a chance to go on and pick this one up. But without Sununu, I don't think there's much of a pathway forward for them to take that one. And then we get to the state of Maine. Susan Collins, she's done really well in statewide elections in the state of Maine in the past. That's going to change this time around. It's going to be much more competitive. The Democrats have a shot at picking this one up. The only other senator out of all 100 senators that has a higher disapproval number in her his or her home state is Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. Susan Collins could even be in a situation where she has a tough time winning that Republican primary, but Collins, in what hasn't necessarily been great Republican years in the past, has shown that she can still have success in the state, and maybe she surprises some people and is able to perform a bit better than expected like she has in past elections. And then, again, obviously she has that incumbency advantage on top of it. So this is probably the best case scenario for the Republicans, where they could get up to 55 Senate seats, where the Democrats would be at 45. So that would be a net 2 gain from where they currently stand, picking up. In this instance, they would be picking up Alabama as well as Michigan. But the Republicans are defending so many more seats this time around than what they were back in 2018 that it's just a tough map for them to try to really pick up anything in the way of seats. They're just trying to defend their majority. What's probably more likely to happen is a scenario where you're getting really close to 50-50, where states like Colorado, Arizona, and Maine are going to be really tough potentially for the Republicans to retain. But even if they lose those 3, they could still get the majority with a 50-50 and then having the tiebreaker with the vice president if they're able to win the presidency in 2020. So that's going to wrap this one up, guys. I appreciate you guys stopping by. Consider subscribing to my YouTube channel, and hope to see you guys back here for my next video.